Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she listens to a melody that wasn't played on any instrument, written on any sheet, or heard by anyone else. It was hummed softly, between sobs, by someone who was supposed to be gone. Stay with me till the end, because the reason behind that tune isn't just heartbreaking, it's unforgettable. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second, until the very end. Chapter 1. The melody in the turret was on one of those mild, honey-colored afternoons in St. Mary Mead when the air seemed steeped in the scent of mown grass and distant lilac, that the first faint tremor of tragedy slipped into the village. The sound of it came, oddly enough, as music, a wavering, uncertain humming that carried from the garden gate of Miss Elspeth Grant's cottage. Mrs. Caroline Elwood, returning from the post office with a small parcel under her arm, paused in surprise. Elspeth, usually a brisk and rather no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, was sitting on the low stone wall, her shoulders bowed, her face hidden behind one gloved hand. From behind that trembling hand came the tuna's sweet, old-fashioned melody, one Caroline half recognized from somewhere deep in her youth. But it was not the song that unsettled her. It was the quiet sob that broke through between the notes. That evening, gossip in the village began its slow and sure climb, as ivy might on an old brick wall. By the time Mrs. Elwood had taken tea with Mrs. Price at the grocer's, and Mrs. Price had told Mr. Benton at the post office, and Mr. Benton had mentioned it to his sister over supper, it had become a curious tale indeed. Some said Miss Grant had been heard arguing with someone in her garden the night before. Others insisted that the humming was part of an odd little ritual she had whenever she was in distress. But the question that hovered over teacups and lingered in doorways was always the same. Why was she crying in the first place? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. The following morning, Miss Marple, who had been quietly deadheading roses in her own front garden, heard the clatter of hurried footsteps on the lane. Young Tommy Benton, red-faced and breathing hard, came running up to her gate. His words, when they came, were in that breathless rush that betrays both excitement and fear. "Miss Marple, Miss Grant's she's been found." He swallowed. "Dead, in her parlor. They say murder." It was the sort of word that, in a place like St. Mary Mead, seemed too large, too coarse for the air. Yet it sat there now, between them, as solid as any object in the lane. Miss Marple, after the smallest pause, set her pruning shears on the garden wall. Her expression was mild, but her blue eyes, bright and knowing, rested on Tommy's face a fraction longer than necessary. "How very distressing," she murmured, her voice quiet enough that the words seemed meant only for herself. By midday, the village was a restless hive of speculation. Mrs. Price recalled that she had sold Miss Grant a tin of cocoa just 2 days ago. Couldn't possibly have imagined such an end. Mr. Benton, the postmaster, remembered a telegram that had come for her last week, though of course he hadn't read it, but it might have been from her cousin in Bath, who was always a bit peculiar. There was mention of a stranger in the village, a man with a worn leather case, seen loitering near the green dot. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her afternoon tea by the lace-curtained window, looking across at the neat sweep of the lane. She had known Elspeth Grant for nearly 20 years, an agreeable, if somewhat guarded, woman, who took her tea weak and her conversations in short doses. There was something about that humming, the afternoon before the choice of tune, the precise intervals in the notes that had already lodged itself in Miss Marple's mind. People often assumed distress made one careless, but in Miss Marple's long observation of human behavior, She knew it could sometimes make one most deliberate. When Constable Reeves passed along the lane toward Miss Grant's cottage, Miss Marple rose, fetched her hat, and stepped into the warm afternoon light. She had, as she often did, the look of someone on the most ordinary of errands, but her mind, quite unlike her unhurried step, was already arranging the fragments of a puzzle whose shape she could only just begin to see, and somewhere at its center was the picture of a woman, alone on a stone wall, humming an old tune through her tears. Chapter 2 whispers along the greenth day after Miss Grant's death dawned pale and hesitant, as though the sun itself were reluctant to shine on such unsettling business. In St. Mary Mead, however, life rarely halted for long, even in the shadow of tragedy. The milk cart rattled down the lane as usual, the postman did his rounds, and Mrs. Elwood was seen at the butcher's selecting a modest joint of lamb. But beneath the routine lay a certain restlessness, a quiet prickling of unease. It was there in the way people lingered longer than usual in shop doorways, voices lowered, eyes darting toward the corner where Miss Grant's ivy-covered cottage sat in its neat patch of garden. A strip of police tape fluttered faintly across the front gate, its bright, alien yellow clashing with the polite order of the village. Constable Reeves had been kept busy since dawn, fending off well-meaning villagers who only wanted to be of help and, in the same breath, asking whether it was true about the marks on the carpet or the broken cup in the parlor. He offered little, except to confirm that the coroner had been and gone, and that Inspector Graves from the county had taken over the matter. The inspector was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a brisk manner and a way of looking at people that made them either straighten their backs or grow suddenly defensive. By mid-morning, he was seen striding along the green, his notes in one hand, pausing to exchange brief words with Reeves before disappearing into the cottage. Miss Marple observed all this from her garden gate, her knitting bag looped over one arm, the needles within clicking faintly as she moved. She had gone out ostensibly to enjoy the warm air, but her eyes clear, shrewd, and faintly amused missed little. She noticed Mrs. Price, for instance, crossing to the green with a basket on her arm and slowing just enough to catch a glimpse through Miss Grant's open parlor door. She noticed the vicar's wife, Mrs. Lister, pass briskly by, her lips pressed tight, and the faintest shadow of disapproval in her gaze as she glanced toward the growing knot of curious onlookers. The heart of the gossip centered, inevitably, on the final hours before Miss Grant's death. Mrs. Elwood's account of the humming and crying had spread with remarkable speed, and by the time it reached Mrs. Price, it had grown to include the claim that Miss Grant had been seen clutching a sealed envelope in her free hand. Mr. Benton, from the post office, hinted knowingly that Miss Grant had received something rather upsetting in the last week, though he was careful not to say from whom. And then there was the matter of the stranger, a dark-haired man, early 40s perhaps, carrying a scuffed leather case, seen loitering near the green on the very day before the tragedy. No one, it seemed, had seen him since. By late afternoon, Inspector Graves had made his first appearance at the vicarage, speaking in low tones to Reverend Lister about arrangements for the inquest. From the snippets overheard by Mrs. Price, who was, by chance, tending her front border at the time, it appeared the inspector was working on the theory that Miss Grant had known her assailant. It was, she later remarked to Mrs. Elwood, almost certainly someone from the village, because who else would she have let into her parlor of an evening? Miss Marple, for her part, had spent the morning in what seemed to be the most harmless of pursuits, arranging her kitchen drawers, writing a short letter to her niece, and preparing a modest sponge cake for tea. Yet behind her calm routine, her mind sifted through what she had heard and, more importantly, what she had not heard. People were generous with theories, but very few spoke about Miss Grant herself, her habits, her friendships, her occasional silences at gatherings. Those silences, Miss Marple knew from long acquaintance, had a way of concealing more than mere shyness. In the early evening, she took her tea in the front parlor, her chair angled so she could see the lane. A slight movement beyond the hedge caught her attention. Inspector Graves, stepping out of the cottage, was speaking to Reeves in a voice too low for her to catch. He glanced once toward her house, then away again, as though making a mental note. Presently, Reeves broke away and crossed toward her gate. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap with a touch of awkwardness, "the inspector would like to have a word. If it's no trouble, just to see if you might have noticed anything, what with you living so close and all." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, setting her teacup down with the air of someone accustomed to such requests. "Why, of course, Constable. I shall be happy to tell him anything I know, though I dare say it won't amount to much." And in truth, she did intend to give him only what seemed ordinary, her recollection of Miss Grant, sitting on the wall, the tune she hummed, the fact that she appeared upset. She had learned long ago that to be helpful without seeming to helpful was often the best way to ensure she was not overlooked later. When Inspector Graves arrived, his questions were brisk but polite. He asked about visitors to the lane, whether she had seen the stranger, whether Miss Grant had seemed troubled of late. Miss Marple answered each in her gentle, meandering way, occasionally digressing into anecdotes about the habits of neighbors, an approach which, to the untrained ear, might have seemed rambling, but which allowed her to offer certain details without appearing to have chosen them deliberately. She mentioned, for example, that Miss Grant's garden gate had been newly oiled, an odd thing for her to do, given her dislike of practical chores, and that the hum of the old tune had been steady, almost measured, not the broken sort of melody one might expect from someone overcome with grief. When the inspector left, Miss Marple sat for a moment in the quiet, her gaze drifting to the neat line of geraniums on her windowsill. Somewhere in her thoughts, a small thread had begun to form, a thread she suspected would lead, in time, to a knot worth unraveling. Outside, the lane settled into its evening hush, but beneath the calm, St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next turn in the story. Chapter 3. The Stranger's Shadow. The next morning, the village's sense of unease had settled into something more stubborn, less like shock, more like a low and constant hum beneath the surface of everyday life. The market stalls were set up, as usual, on the green, with Mrs. Price arranging her jars of pickled onions, and Mr. Talbot weighing out apples for Mrs. Elwood. But the talk between customers was softer than usual, full of quick glances toward the lane, where Miss Grant's cottage still stood under its strip of pale yellow tape. Even the sparrows seemed to chirp with less abandon, as if the village's very air had grown more cautious. It was Mrs. Price who, inevitably, introduced the stranger back into conversation. While wrapping Mrs. Elwood's apples in newspaper, she remarked that her cousin's husband had seen a man of foreign appearance near the green late on Tuesday afternoon, the day before Miss Grant was found. The fellow had been carrying a leather case, the sort used for instruments or delicate tools, and had looked ever so out of place among the comfortable English hedgerows. There was a certain relish in Mrs. Price's voice as she described the incident, though she was careful to add that she wasn't saying he had anything to do with it, only that it was strange he had vanished so quickly. Miss Marple, who happened to be examining a small bunch of carrots at the next stall, seemed barely to register the remark. She selected her carrots, paid, and made some gentle observation about the weather turning fine for planting sweet peas. But her mind, beneath the polite surface, was quietly sifting what she had just heard. She knew from experience that strangers in villages were often remembered with more detail than they were actually seen, and that the very act of remembering could color the truth. Yet there was something about the leather case, and about the fact that no one seemed to know where the man had gone, that tugged at her curiosity. Inspector Graves, too, appeared to take the matter seriously. That afternoon, he was seen near the green, speaking to Reeves and two other constables, and the description of the stranger was passed from mouth to mouth like a shared secret. By tea time, the man had been transformed into all manner of possibilities: a foreign tradesman, a debt collector, a traveling musician even, according to Mr. Talbot, one of those government men who go about under false names. Miss Marple spent her afternoon with quiet industry, pruning her roses and setting a small table for tea with her neighbor, Mrs. Elwood. The two women discussed the matter with the sort of gentle detachment that comes from knowing how quickly gossip can sour into certainty. Mrs. Elwood confessed she found it difficult to imagine Miss Grant having any connection to a stranger at all. She had always kept to her own small circle and seemed almost wary of new acquaintances. That, Miss Marple observed mildly, was often true until a need arose that could only be met by someone from outside one's world. Mrs. Elwood frowned at this, uncertain whether it was an idle musing or a pointed remark. Late in the day, when the sunlight had turned the lane to gold, Miss Marple stepped out for a short walk. She took the long route past the vicarage and down toward the edge of the village, where the hedgerows grew tall and the lane narrowed. Here she met young Billy Reeves, the constable's nephew, who was eager to share that his uncle had gone through Miss Grant's correspondence. Nothing much, Billy said, except for one letter from Bath and something from a music shop in London. He grinned, clearly enjoying the drama. Funny thing, though, Uncle says the London letter was only half a page, and there was no return address on it. Miss Marple thanked him with a smile, though she said nothing about the flicker of interest this news stirred in her. The letter from the music shop was curious enough, but combined with the memory of Miss Grant's humming a steady, almost deliberate melody, it suggested something more than mere coincidence. When she returned home, the evening light was fading, and the first lamps were being lit across the green. From her window, Miss Marple could see the faint silhouette of Inspector Graves leaving the cottage, a small notebook in his hand. He paused, as if considering whether to cross the green toward her house, then turned instead toward the vicarage. She watched him go, her knitting idle in her lap, and thought again of the stranger, the leather case, and the letter from London. It was not in her nature to rush toward conclusions. She knew too well that the human heart was rarely simple, and that what seemed the most obvious answer was often the least true. But in the stillness of her parlor, she felt that the pieces she had gathered, so far small, scattered, seemingly unconnected, were part of a pattern waiting to be seen. Somewhere in that pattern was Miss Grant, sitting on her stone wall, humming an old tune through her tears. Somewhere in it, too, was the shadow of a man who had passed through the village and vanished without a trace. The village, she reflected, was holding its breath, waiting for the next ripple in the quiet water, and she, quietly and without fuss, intended to watch for where that ripple would begin. Chapter 4. The Letter Without an Address. Following morning brought a brisk wind that sent petals scattering across the lane, and rattled the sign above Mr. Talbot's shop. It seemed to stir the gossip too, for by the time Miss Marple stepped out to fetch a small loaf from the baker's, talk of the stranger had already given way to speculation about the mysterious letter from London. Mrs. Elwood, coming out of the greengrocer's, leaned closer to Miss Marple as though confiding a family secret. "They say," she whispered, "that the inspectors had a look at all Miss Grant's post, and there was one with no return address at all, just the name of a music shop on the heading and half a page of writing. No one knows what it said." Her eyes shone with the thrill of something unsolved. Miss Marple, with her usual air of mild curiosity, remarked that people often forgot return addresses in their letters, though her mind, as ever, turned the matter over with quiet precision. A music shop was an odd sender for Miss Grant, who, so far as she knew, neither played nor kept an instrument. Yet the memory of that old tune hummed on the stone wall returned with striking clarity. tunes, Miss Marple knew, were like photographs. They could hold meaning long after their origin was forgotten by most. At the baker's, the conversation picked up from where Mrs. Elwood had left it. Mr. Hodge, the baker himself, swore he had once seen Miss Grant at the station in Much Haddam, waiting for the train toward London. This was 2 months back, he said, dusting flour from his hands. She had a small package with her, wrapped in brown paper. Looked the sort of thing a shop might send if they were careful not to damage it. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but now, in the light of recent events, the detail seemed to have acquired significance. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, had begun calling on various villagers who had known Miss Grant well, or at least as well as anyone did. By midday, word reached Miss Marple that he had visited Mrs. Price and spent the better part of an hour there. Mrs. Price later admitted that he had asked whether Miss Grant had close friends, any quarrels or debts. She, of course, had answered in the negative, though she had mentioned seeing Miss Grant speaking to a man near the green some weeks earlier, not the dark-haired stranger of recent talk, but a shorter, older gentleman she didn't recognize. In the afternoon, Miss Marple settled herself in her parlor with a view of the lane. She had learned long ago that people spoke most freely when they believed themselves unobserved, and there was a great deal to be seen in the way a person walked past a house when they thought no one was looking. She noted that Mrs. Elwood passed by twice, each time slowing near Miss Grant's gate. That young Tommy Benton lingered on the corner as though hoping for some drama to unfold, and that Constable Reeves went into the cottage carrying what looked like a folded sheaf of papers. It was later that day, as the light began to fade, that Miss Marple had a quiet visitor. Young Billy Reeves, with his usual eagerness, appeared at her gate and glanced about before speaking. "Uncle says there was something odd about that London letter," he told her. "The writing, it was slanted, like someone trying not to use their usual hand. And the paper, it was good paper, the sort people don't use for ordinary letters." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "And Uncle thinks there was a smudge on the edge, like ink, only red." Miss Marple thanked him with her customary gentleness, offering him a biscuit before he went on his way. She made no visible reaction, but the small details lodged in her mind with the firmness of puzzle pieces sliding into place. A letter in a disguised hand, written on expensive paper, sent from a music shop with no return address, combined with the image of Miss Grant. Humming through her tears it was, she thought, a curious composition indeed. That evening, she took a slow walk to the far side of the village, passing the churchyard and its yew trees. The wind had eased, and the scent of damp earth rose from the ground. She paused by the low wall and looked back toward the green, where lamps were beginning to glow behind lace curtains. St. Mary Mead had always been a place where the familiar concealed the surprising, where quiet facades masked intricate stories. She knew, with the calm certainty of long practice, that whatever had led to Miss Grant's death was bound up not with a sudden impulse of violence, but with something that had been taking shape for some time, perhaps for years. When she returned home, she sat by the window with her knitting, the soft click of needles keeping time with her thoughts. Somewhere between the wool and the lamplight, she began to form a sense, not yet a conclusion, but the faint outline of a truth. It was like hearing the first bars of a tune and knowing there was more to come, that the melody would resolve only when the right note was played. For now, the letter without an address was that note, waiting in silence. Chapter 5. An unfinished 10th morning after her walk to the churchyard. Miss Marple awoke to a soft mist that curled over the hedgerows and turned the rooftops of St. Mary Mead into faint silhouettes. It was the kind of weather that hushed the village, making footsteps sound closer and voices carry further. By 8 o'clock, the only sounds were the milk cart in the lane and the occasional call of a wood pigeon. Yet by mid-morning, news had begun to seep through the quiet, Inspector Graves had been seen again at Miss Grant's cottage, this time in the company of a man carrying a small black case, not the same leather case described by those who had spoken of the stranger, but one more compact, the sort of photographer or watchmaker might use. Mrs. Elwood naturally had the fullest account. She had spotted them from her kitchen window, the inspector holding the door for the man, who wore a neat gray suit and carried himself with the air of someone accustomed to being listened to, an expert of some kind, she told Mrs. Price later that morning. Perhaps a handwriting man, come to look at that odd letter, or something to do with music. He had that sort of delicate look about him. Mrs. Price, nodding sagely, agreed that it was quite possible, though she later told Mr. Talbot she thought the fellow looked more like a solicitor. Miss Marple heard of the visitor in her own way by not asking directly, but allowing the information to come to her over the course of errands. At the post office, she purchased a new sheet of stamps and remarked on the pleasant weather for the dahlias, whereupon Mr. Benton confided that Inspector Graves had sent for someone from London. On account of the peculiarities in the letter's paper and ink, he leaned forward as though sharing a rare morsel. Special paper, apparently watermarked, but faint, and that red smudge, not ink at all, but a trace of sealing wax. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor, thinking about the sealing wax. It was a small, old-fashioned thing. Most people hadn't used it for years, but she knew that certain trades and certain habits lingered long after they were considered common. In her experience, sealing wax often meant either sentimentality or secrecy, and sometimes both. It was not difficult to imagine Miss Grant as the sort of woman who might treasure an old letter, but it was rather harder to picture her sealing a new one herself. The matter of the tune continued to trouble her as well. In the days since Miss Grant's death, she had found herself humming it without realizing, the notes returning unbidden while she worked in the garden or stirred a pot on the stove. That morning, she paused in her knitting and hummed it aloud, slowly and with care. The melody was deliberate, evenly spaced, the sort of thing that might have been part of a song once, though perhaps not in any popular sense. She recalled hearing something similar years ago at a wedding, though the association was faint, like a memory seen through frosted glass. By the third day, the village's patience was fraying. People wanted an arrest, or at the very least, some pronouncement from Inspector Graves to show that progress was being made. Instead, he kept his own counsel, speaking only to Reeves and occasionally to the vicar. Rumors multiplied to fill the silence. Mrs. Price was certain the dark-haired stranger had been sent to retrieve something from Miss Grant's cottage. Mr. Talbot suggested that Miss Grant had been blackmailed. Mrs. Elwood favored the idea of a family quarrel, perhaps over an inheritance. Miss Marple, listening to these theories, found herself thinking of Elspeth Grant's peculiar blend of reserve and decisiveness. She had never been a woman to act without a reason, and the act of sitting on the wall to hum a tune in full view of the lane, even while crying, struck Miss Marple as a form of signaling not to the general village, but to someone who would understand. Such signaling, she knew, could be every bit as telling as words. That afternoon, she was making her way to the green when she met Inspector Graves himself, striding in the opposite direction. He greeted her with a polite nod, then hesitated. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wonder, have you by chance any knowledge of musical matters, or of shops in London that deal in them?" She smiled modestly, saying she had only the faintest acquaintance with such things, but knew people who might. Graves considered this, then remarked that the music shop which had sent the letter no longer existed, its premises empty, its records gone, which, he added dryly, makes it rather difficult to determine why Miss Grant should have had cause to correspond with them. They parted after a few more words, and Miss Marple continued to the green, her mind turning over the inspector's remark. A shop that no longer existed was of limited use in a direct sense, but if someone had used its name as a heading, then it was a deliberate choice, meant to conceal the real source. That kind of misdirection, she reflected, was not the work of an amateur. As she walked home in the cool evening air, she passed the vicarage and saw Mrs. Lister in the garden, pruning roses. They spoke briefly, and Mrs. Lister, after a moment's hesitation, mentioned that Miss Grant had once been engaged, many years ago, to a man who played the violin professionally. It was broken off under unfortunate circumstances, Mrs. Lister said, her tone making it clear that further detail was not for public consumption. But I always thought she kept some memento, perhaps a piece of music. Miss Marple thanked her and walked on, her thoughts sharpening with each step. A man with a violin case might have passed for the stranger with the leather case. If seen only in passing, a letter on music shop paper could have been a private signal to someone from long ago, and the tune steady, deliberate, and unmistakable might have been the one thing meant to summon a ghost from the past. In her parlor that night, the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to match the rhythm of the melody in her mind. She was certain now that the tune and the letter were bound together, and that to understand one would be to understand the other. But the shape of the whole, who had sent it, why it had come now, and why Miss Grant was dead remained, for the moment, an unfinished composition. Chapter 6. The inquest in Minor Keith inquest was fixed for the following afternoon, in the parish hall, and St. Mary Mead, which could be sprightly enough for harvest suppers and jumble sales, wore an awkward gravity that did not quite fit its bunting hooks and trestle tables. A faint smell of furniture polish lingered among the folding chairs, and Mrs. Lister had arranged a modest vase of foxgloves on the windowsill, as if gentility might ward off ugliness. People arrived earlier than they needed to, speaking in the hush that villages reserve for weddings and funerals. Yet each carried that pricking curiosity which no hush can ever fully subdue. Miss Marple, in a pale summer hat, slipped into a seat near the back, her hands folded neatly over her gloves. Inspector Graves, already at the front with the coroner, wore an expression that was sober, professional, and withholding, as if he were watchful of the village as much as the case. Dr. Hayward gave evidence first. In his precise, slightly weary manner, he had been called to Miss Grant's cottage just after 9 in the morning, found her in the parlor near the hearth rug, and concluded that death had occurred sometime in the late evening prior. The cause, he stated, was consistent with a blow to the head, delivered with a blunt instrument not immediately recovered at the scene. There were no signs of prolonged struggle, no forced entry, no indication of poison. Questions were few, answers fewer. What the hall absorbed most eagerly was the phrase someone she likely admitted herself, which fell into the room like a pebble into a still pond, and set small ripples going through every row of chairs. A woman like Miss Grant might admit any number of respectable sorts in St. Mary Mead, and so the room thought as one each respectable sort might be anyone else entirely in the right. Light. Mrs. Elwood, inevitably, was called. She spoke of the humming and the crying on the stone wall, of the wavering, old-fashioned tune. She did not embellish. Miss Marple, who knew her tendency to embroidery, noted the restraint with quiet approval, and she added only that Miss Grant's posture had struck her as determined rather than collapsed, as if the tears had been conceded rather than surrendered. The coroner asked about visitors, quarrels, debts. Mrs. Elwood shook her head. When she was dismissed, she returned to her seat with color high in her cheeks, and neighbors leaned slightly her way, as though a brush with officialdom had raised her temperature. The hall made a little effort to breathe again. Then came Mr. Benton from the post office, and with him the matter of the letter from London. He was careful, almost prim, explaining that he had not read private contents, only handled the envelope and seen the letterhead in the course of passing it over the counter. Some days earlier, he described the paper as a cut above the ordinary and admitted he had once seen Miss Grant receive another letter of similar quality years before, when a telegram had followed soon after from Bath. To the question of whether any parcels had arrived recently, he answered no. To the question about a stranger collecting post restanti, he considered and shook his head. He did, however, remember Miss Grant once asking when the last train to London left of an evening, which caused the hall to tilt imperceptibly toward the notion of a rendezvous. It was a small surprise to many when the coroner called a final witness, Miss Lydia Carstone, a figure not often seen at village teas, who rented rooms over Talbot's shop and taught piano in Much Haddam on Thursdays. Lydia was a thin woman with a long, pale face and carefully tended gloves, the sort of person who seemed perpetually in transit between politenesses. She spoke softly, and one had to lean to catch her words. She had, she said, heard Miss Grant humming something much like an air from an old country dance, though she could not name it. She had paused by the gate, intending to offer help, found herself discouraged by Miss Grant's private manner, and gone on. When asked if she knew Miss Grant, she answered that they had exchanged pleasantries about roses and once about a violinist at a charity concert in Bath years ago. A fine player, Lydia murmured, though his temperament interfered. It was said without malice, like someone repeating a weather report from a distant county. The jury returned the expected verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, and the hall emptied with that brisk, relieved shuffling that belongs to endings which are not endings at all. Outside, the wind had freshened, and the bunting hooks rattled softly against the windows. Miss Marple stood on the steps a moment longer than most, watching Inspector Graves speak to Dr. Hayward by the light gate. She noticed how Graves's gaze flicked to the parish notice board, and then to Lydia Carstone's retreating back. She noticed the way Mrs. Price tried to ask 3 questions at once, and received none of the answers she wanted. And she noticed, very particularly, that the foxgloves had been set in water that was faintly pink, as though a blossom had bled a little into the vase. It meant nothing and everything at once. Little accidents of color often hung about scenes. Where feeling had run high dot in the late afternoon, she walked the lane toward Miss Grant's cottage with the slow patience of one, allowing her thoughts to collect themselves. Reeves was stationed at the gate, dour but friendly, and he raised the tape just enough to let the inspector pass out and Miss Marple, with tactful timing, to pass in with him. She offered no presumption, only a gentle, "I wondered, Inspector, if the parlor rug might reveal something about the Blow people. Are very attached to where they stand. You know." Graves gave her an unreadable look but inclined his head. In the parlor, light fell in a mild square on the carpet, showing the place where the rug's pile had been pressed oddly out of grain, as if something had been moved and then set back not quite true. A small brass fender had been polished that morning. A china shepherdess on the mantel looked a fraction to the left of center. Miss Marple bent to consider the hearth, not touching, only noting. If an object had been used and returned, it had been returned by someone who feared the obvious and trusted the ordinary. Always a dangerous combination. She did not linger. In the hallway, her attention strayed to the umbrella stand, where a lacquered parasol with a chipped handle leaned companionably against a sober walking stick. The parasol was Miss Grant's, floral, slightly frivolous, of 14 summers past, and the walking stick was not. It was not new, but it had been well cared for. The ferrule showed London pavements rather than village lanes. The polish spoke of someone who observed surfaces. It might have belonged to a visitor, a gentleman who carried the habit of cities with him wherever he went. Visitors forget umbrellas, Miss Marple observed mildly, and Graves said, without looking up from his notes, that he was aware. His tone did not dismiss her. It merely tested how much she was prepared to say. She said nothing more. Testing was a two-way craft. By evening, the village had resumed its purposeful idling. Pots were watered, small dogs walked, the smell of onions drifted from the Elwood's kitchen. Miss Marple brewed tea and, after a moment's hesitation, added a slip of lemon. As she did when something required just a touch more clarity, she sat in her chair and, quite softly, hummed the tune again, slower now, listening to the fall and rise as if the notes were stepping stones across a stream. At the fourth bar there was a pause no player would have taken unless it had been written, and at the end a cadence that did not quite close, the sort of cadence that asks to be answered by another voice. An unfinished tune, indeed, and one that wanted a duet. The memory of Lydia Carstone's comment about temperament drifted through her mind, like a hand brushing over piano keys. Temperament in a violinist meant sudden weather, squalls of feeling, a pride that preferred stage light to daylight. Pride was a poor companion in cottages. It banged its shin on small truths. The next ripple came just before dusk, in the form of a knock at Miss Marple's door. A young woman stood there in a travel-stained frock, hair coiled hastily, eyes too bright for politeness. She introduced herself as Alice Grant, Elspeth's cousin from Bath, and apologized for the lateness, for the intrusion, for the train that had been late, and then the bus that had been later. Her voice had the strained steadiness of someone who had promised herself not to cry again, until the bed curtain was drawn. Miss Marple settled her gently with tea and the suggestion of a sandwich, and by degrees the young woman's story unspooled. A family quarrel long ago over an engagement that had turned sour, a small legacy held in reserve against old trouble, a letter from Elspeth, posted a fortnight earlier, asking Alice to send on the red stick from the workbox, which Alice, puzzled but obedient, had done. With it had gone a single phrase: "The tune is nearly finished. Do you remember the last bar?" It was not drama that stirred Miss Marple then, but recognition. A red stick from a workbox was one thing to the practical eye and another to the eye that loved small rituals. Sealing wax, of course, not common lately, but beloved by women who thought carefully about what to show and what to keep secret. And the last bar of a tune, well, that was exactly the part one needed. If one wished to know whether an air meant marriage or mourning, she asked Alice a few soft questions about the past, about the violinist, about whether Elspeth had ever sung words to that air. Alice shook her head, only humming, but she did remember a childish game, long ago in Bath, where Elspeth had tapped rhythms on the table and made Alice guess letters from the beats, as though music could carry a message from one mind to another without the nuisance of ink. When Alice had gone at last to the vicarage to take a spare room for the night, Miss Marple stood a moment at her window and looked out on the green. Lamps pricked the dusk. Reeves's silhouette shifted at the gate like a chess piece between moves. She thought of the walking stick and the parasol, of foxgloves blushing into their water, of a letterhead belonging to a shop that was no more, and of a childish code remembered at the exact moment one needed it. Somewhere among these ordinary things the finishing bar waited, not loud, not operatic, simply the right note in the right hand. She sat again, drew her knitting into her lap, and let the needles click softly, keeping time with a tune that now, in her mind, had begun to answer itself. Chapter 7. The note between the notice. Next morning dawned with a thin veil of cloud that softened the light over St. Mary Mead, as though the day itself were hesitant to declare its intentions. Miss Marple, who had risen early, took her tea in the small back garden, listening to the sparrows quarreling in the ivy. Her thoughts drifted again to Alice Grant's visit, to the curious phrase in her cousin's letter, "The tune is nearly finished. Do you remember the last bar?" and to the red stick of sealing wax that had been sent in answer. It had the feel of an old habit revived, something once private and long dormant that had been summoned back into use for a particular purpose. And if the message was intended to be understood only by Alice, then it suggested someone else had either learned of it or feared its meaning. Enough to silence Elspeth entirely. By mid-morning, the village was in its usual motion, though that motion carried a certain stiffness. Like a play in which each actor was wary of missing their cue, Mrs. Price, at her stall, arranged jars of jam with excessive precision. Mr. Talbot weighed potatoes as if they were gold ingots. The gossip had settled into familiar grooves. Some still leaned toward the mysterious stranger. Others favored a long smoldering family quarrel. Miss Marple noted, as she passed, that Inspector Graves had stationed Reeves near the post office rather than by Miss Grant's gate, a shift that hinted the center of interest had moved perhaps toward the letter and its origins. She made her way to the vicarage under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly to Mrs. Lister, but in truth to inquire, delicately, after Alice, the young woman, had slept poorly, Mrs. Lister reported, and was now resting with a book in the small upstairs room. Miss Marple asked if she might have a few words when Alice was ready, and was rewarded an hour later with a knock at the door. Alice appeared pale but composed, her hands twisting together in a way that betrayed the strain she was under. They sat in the vicarage garden, where the yews kept off most of the wind, and Miss Marple guided the conversation with gentle nudges. Alice admitted that the code with the tune had begun as a childish game between herself and Elspeth, tapping out rhythms or humming sequences that, when matched to a certain old hymn in their school songbook, would spell out letters. It was nonsense, really, Alice said, but we thought ourselves terribly clever at the time. She had not thought of it in years. Yet the moment she saw the phrase about the last bar in Elspeth's letter, the memory had come rushing back. She had not tried to work it out, assuming the rest of the message would come later. Miss Marple asked, lightly, whether anyone else had ever known of their game. Alice frowned. Only one person, I suppose Robert. Robert, it emerged, had been the violinist. The man Elspeth had once been engaged to. He had been friendly with Alice for a short time before the engagement soured, and the quarrel with the family followed. He was, Alice said, the sort of man who noticed things, noticing, in this case, their silly code and teasing them about it. Miss Marple listened without interruption, filing away the fact with the quiet satisfaction of someone adding another bead to a string. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked past Miss Grant's cottage, glancing briefly at the drawn curtains of the parlor. She thought of the walking stick in the umbrella stand, the polish on its wood, and the fact that Robert, if he had come, would be a man more accustomed to city pavements than country mud. She also thought of Lydia Carstone, with her pale gloves and careful words at the inquest, and her mention of temperament in a violinist. If Lydia had been acquainted with Robert, she had chosen her phrasing with unusual delicacy, which in itself was revealing. The post office proved fruitful in its own quiet way. While buying a packet of envelopes, Miss Marple remarked to Mr. Benton how curious it must be to see so many different kinds of handwriting each day. Benton, pleased to display his observational skills, confided that the hand on Elspeth's last letter was unlike any he'd seen from her before. More cramped, more angular. He supposed it might have been written in haste or under strain. Miss Marple agreed mildly, but in her mind she saw the possibility that the letter had not been written by Elspeth at all, but by someone imitating her well enough to fool a casual eye, though not the intimate one of a relative. By early evening, the mist had thickened again, and lamps glowed faintly in the windows along the green. Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, letting her thoughts wander in their usual unhurried way. The case, as the inspector saw it, likely hinged on opportunity and proximity. Someone Elspeth trusted enough to admit, someone present on that evening, someone with a reason to fear what she might reveal. But Miss Marple's own sense told her it also hinged on the peculiar blend of music and message, on the unfinished tune that was as much part of the crime as any physical clue. She hummed it again, this time noting the rhythm more carefully. When she reached the pause before the final phrase, she tapped the arm of her chair lightly once, twice, 3 times, imagining how the notes might fit into their old childish code. She did not have the key to the message yet, but she could feel the shape of it, the way one can sense a word on the tip of the tongue before it comes into speech. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Reeves, his cap in his hands, looking slightly apologetic. Inspector wondered if you might recall seeing anyone pass along the lane on the night Miss Grant died besides the usual neighbors. Miss Marple shook her head. Then, after a moment's pause, asked whether anyone had claimed the walking stick found in her umbrella stand. Reeves said no, it had been taken in for examination, but yielded nothing obvious. Funny thing, though, he added, the handle was worn smooth on one side, as if it had been held for hours at a time, and there was a faint smell of varnish fresh. When Reeves left, Miss Marple remained by the door a moment longer, the cool air from the lane brushing against her face. Fresh varnish suggested care taken to restore something before it was seen, perhaps to disguise age or wear. A man returning to the village after a long absence might wish to appear unchanged, but objects like tunes had their own histories, and some were harder to polish away than others. As she returned to her chair, Miss Marple's mind settled, not on the image of Elspeth's stone wall or the stranger's leather case, but on the space between 2 notes in a tune, a space meant for an answer that never came. She knew that somewhere in the village, someone carried that answer still, as surely as they might carry a secret folded deep in their pocket. And she, with her patient needles and her humming, meant to be there when it was taken out into the light. Chapter 8. Tea for 2 and a question. The next day broke with a pale, tidy sun that made St. Mary Mead look almost excessively innocent, the hedges newly clipped, and the green brushed smooth by an early wind. Miss Marple, who disliked being hurried by weather or people, set a small tray in her parlor with the quiet intent of receiving a guest. She had sent a note by Tommy Benton, very polite, inviting Miss Lydia Carstone to tea at 4 o'clock, for a word about him, tunes, and memory. It was the sort of invitation that could not alarm a careful woman, and Lydia, being careful, sent back a short acceptance in a hand as narrow as a ladder. Miss Marple spent the interval in the back garden deadheading marigolds, and considering how best to ask questions that did not look like questions, humming the unfinished tune under her breath until the very pause in it felt like a finger tapped twice on the inside of a closed drawer. Inspector Graves appeared just after noon, hat in hand and gravel on his shoes, and stood on the step with the mild impatience of a man who dislikes embroidery, but has learned to respect it when done by certain needlewomen. He asked whether Miss Marple had made progress with that musical business, and she, with an air of apologetic vagueness, confessed only to faint recollections of schoolroom tricks. She mentioned, as if idly, that Alice remembered a hymn book cipher. Graves's eyes sharpened in the way that reveals a mind filing a card. He told her he had traced the walking stick to a Soho instrument repair, no name, of course, only an occasional cash customer, and that fresh varnish had indeed masked old scuffs. A man tidying his past, Miss Marple murmured, pouring him a short cup of tea he had not asked for, and Graves, after a pause, accepted both the cup and the inference with a grunt that might have been thanks. It for precisely. Lydia Carstone arrived in dove gray, her gloves carefully buttoned, and the faintest scent of violet water announcing a woman who preferred to be noticed for propriety rather than presence. She sat where Miss Marple placed her, accepted sponge cake in small, fastidious bites, and remarked on the late roses, which were brave but misguided. Miss Marple, who enjoyed being underestimated as much as any cat in a sunbeam, offered a gentle confession. She had an elderly hymn book somewhere, which had once served for childish games. "I wonder," she said, "if you ever knew such nonsense matching bars to letters and so on. Children always think the world won't listen unless they make it a riddle first." Lydia's smile trembled only at the corners, then steadied. "Girls do adore puzzles," she agreed, the word girls placing herself very firmly outside the circle. Miss Marple produced the hymn book like an afterthought, the leather cracked in kind lines, and opened it where a ribbon had conveniently found the old-school favorite, "Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past." She hummed Elspeth's tune softly, stopping before the last phrase, and let one finger travel the staves with an absent tap-tap. "There," she said, almost to herself, "that little rest. When I was a silly thing, we made it stand for an I don't know why habit. I suppose." Lydia leaned without leaning, one of those movements that does not displace air, and said, lightly, "How quaint." Miss Marple did not look up, but caught the fractional delay before the word, a delay the length of a single stitched bead sliding to its place. People betray themselves in the space between certainty and agreement. It is a very short space, but quite audible if one is listening for it. They passed 15 pleasant minutes on the sanctioned topics: weather, the vicar's admirable sermons, the vulgarity of modern train compartments, while Miss Marple hummed a phrase now and then as if music were merely the air her thoughts preferred. On the second humming, Lydia's gaze flicked, just once, to the mantel shelf, where a cracked china shepherdess stood to precisely left of center. On the third, she asked, in that careful tone one uses for an aunt's hobby, whether Miss Marple herself played. "Goodness, no," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "I have always relied upon those who play for us. Accompanists are such generous creatures." It was a small word to lay on the table. Lydia's cup paused on its saucer, barely the width of a breath. "One grows used to being in the second chair," she said. "It is restful." Miss Marple's smile was wool-soft. "Unless the first chair is badly led, my dear. Then the second does all the work and none of the bowing." When Lydia had gone, no flurry, only a neat withdrawal. Miss Marple fetched the hymn book to the writing table and, with the quiet absorption of an embroiderer unpicking a too eager knot, sketched letters under the notes she remembered Elspeth humming on the wall. She allowed for childish liberties, for the old rule that every fourth bar belonged to the rest letter, and for the habit, so common in girls, of doubling a meaningful consonant as if it were a promise. In 15 minutes she had a row of hesitant characters that would not stand up to a magistrate, but were quite persuasive to a village mind. RCH, then a pause, then OA, then another rest like a held breath, and at the end the suggestion of an E or perhaps an I, depending how one counted the cadence. She did not write the whole word. It is unwise to rush headlong at a door that may open inward, but she looked up, after a time, at the vicarage yews and thought of the Lightgate's timbered arch where notices were pinned, and of the old coach road past the mill that turned slyly behind Lydia's rooms above Talbot's shop. Near dusk, Alice came by with red-rimmed eyes and a firm chin that made Miss Marple like her more. They sat with the hymn book between them like a small hearth. Together they hummed, tapping bars as if they were counting stitches, and Alice, with the clumsy confidence of one who has almost remembered, supplied 2 more letters from a variant of the game the cousins had played. Another A after the first pause, and, later, an R shaped by the tiniest turn in the tune. "Arch-or." Alice laughed at her own nonsense, and then stopped laughing. "There used to be a half door at Elspeth's back kitchen we called the Or, because the latch stuck out like one," she said, bewildered by memory's mischief. "Oh, but that's foolish." "Not at all," Miss Marple said softly. "Houses tell their stories in kitchen language." She let the letters sit where they were and did not force them into sense. Sense prefers to come in of its own accord. Reeves arrived with a message from Inspector Graves, a search to be conducted next morning. along the old coach road for any trace of a camp or discarded case. The village would know before breakfast, of course. Searches are public things even when they pretend to be private. Miss Marple asked Reeves, quite as if it were an afterthought, whether the parish notice board key had lately gone missing. He scratched his head, surprised she knew. The vicar had indeed complained of a mislaid key, found again in the poor box tray as if absent-mindedly tittied there. Was it, Miss Marple asked, sticky? Reeves blinked. As it happens, yes. Resin or something. When he had gone, Miss Marple held the hymn book a long while, thinking of rosin on bow hair and the tack of sealing wax, and of hands that could live in both worlds without noticing the difference. Toward evening she took her shawl and walked, unhurried, the length of the green. At the light gate the world held its breath the way it does where names are posted. Notices curled at the corners, a sale of work, a harvest appeal. Lydia Carstone's Thursday lessons in much had him typed with a ribbon that had begun to fade. Miss Marple stood quite still and allowed the place to speak. The arch above her smelled faintly of old smoke and polish. In a seam of the timber a thin crumble of red clung, as if a thread had snagged there and been worried free. She did not touch it. She had learned, over many years, that there are things better left for a policeman to find, lest he feel robbed of his profession. But she filed the color away next to the foxglove water and the smudge on the letterhead, and the stick from Soho that wanted to be younger than it was. Back home. She wrote a short note to Inspector Graves suggesting, in her most apologetically domestic handwriting, that if one were to look not only where a case might be dropped, but where an advertisement might be pinned with sufficient ceremony to satisfy an actor's temperament, one might save an hour's walking. She sealed it, perhaps with the smallest smile at her own mischief, and sent Tommy Benton trotting with it to the station house. Then she laid out the hymn book and, for the first time, filled in the last bar she had left blank. Not a letter, not yet, but the sign she and Alice had used long ago to mean repeat from here. It was a child's device, inelegant, and it changed everything. If the message repeated, then the half-made word would double itself around a hinge, folding like a card. Archer became, in that mirror, COACH arch, the old road and the old gate speaking to each other as plainly as neighbors over a fence. She did not run with her discovery. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because one must keep faith with kettles. As the water began to sound like far rain, she considered the gentlest of possibilities that Elspeth had set to meeting points as one, the gate for a signal and the road for the rendezvous, and that someone with a mended stick and a case that could pass as any case had come by one and taken the other. Somewhere in that exchange the last bar had fallen silent. The house ticked. Outside, a bicycle bell chimed and faded. Miss Marple poured her tea and let it sit, then took a cautious sip and allowed herself the smallest nod. The tune was not finished, not yet, but it was now in a key she could play quietly, onto fingers, so that no one would notice until they were already listening. Chapter 9. The man by the coach rode the morning after Miss Marple sent her discreet note. To Inspector Graves, the village awoke to a curious mixture of expectation and restraint. Like the air before a long-awaited downpour, there was talk of policemen being seen near the old coach road, moving in pairs and peering into the hedgerows as if hunting a wounded pheasant. Reeves was among them, his tall frame unmistakable against the ragged hawthorn, while Graves kept to the shaded verge, speaking occasionally to a man in plain clothes who carried a satchel. By the time Mrs. Price came back from her errands in Much Hatham, it was already known by everyone who mattered that something had been found. What that something was, however, remained locked behind Graves's closed lips, which only deepened the village's appetite for the truth. Miss Marple, for her part, made no inquiry. She spent her morning tending to the lemon verbena in the front border, trimming it with the delicate precision of a woman who thinks best when her hands are busy. She saw Graves cross the green toward the vicarage around noon, Reeves following at a respectful distance with what looked like a wrapped bundle under his arm. She caught only a glimpse of it, but it was enough a rectangular shape, roughly the size of a violin case, the wrapping stiff as if concealing a solid, varnished surface. A case that could have belonged to any musician, and thus to no one in particular. It was mid-afternoon when Graves appeared at her gate, his manner as unhurried as if he had merely come to borrow a gardening book. "We found this about 200 yards along the coach road," he said after accepting her invitation to step inside. "Hidden under brush. I thought you might care to see it before I take it on to the station." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a violin case, dark wood, the brass catches dulled with age. One corner bore a faint trace of red wax, smeared as though it had brushed against something soft before drying. "Recognize it?" he asked. Miss Marple bent slightly, examining the faint scuff along the edge. "The polished feel of the handle. It has been well looked after," she murmured, "but not recently. There is a little dust in the catch country dust, not London. And it has been carried on the left arm." She did not add that she had once seen Robert, the violinist of Alice's story, hold his instrument case in precisely that fashion. Graves's eyes, watchful, suggested he was capable of making the connection without her saying so. He went on to explain that inside they had found a violin, a bow, and tucked into the lining a folded scrap of paper bearing nothing more than a string of numbers and letters. Miss Marple asked, mildly, whether the numbers corresponded to anything obvious. "Not to me," Graves admitted, "though they might to you. If the business of hymn tunes and ciphers is as real as you think." She smiled, a little apologetically, and said she would be happy to glance at it. Once Graves had gone, she set the scrap on her writing table and studied it. The sequence was short 5 characters, then a dash, then another 5. Not a date, not a simple word. She fetched the old hymn book and traced the sequence against the hymn they had used for the childish code. Slowly, the numbers fell into place. The first set spelling coach, the second arch. She sat back, her hands folded in her lap. The case, then, was not merely lost. It had been placed left exactly where the cipher said it would be, perhaps for someone to collect. But the person meant to collect it had not been Elspeth. Toward evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk toward the edge of the village, her shawl drawn close against the autumn chill. The coach road lay quiet, the hedge on one side thick with bramble. She could picture the case tucked there, the wax mark catching briefly in the light, the pause of a man bending to retrieve it. She could also picture Elspeth, humming her unfinished tune on the wall, tears in her eyes, but her back straight, signaling to someone that the exchange was to go ahead. And if someone else had intercepted that message, someone who understood the code, then the wrong person might have arrived at the coach road entirely when she returned. She found Alice waiting on her doorstep, looking troubled. She had, she said, been to the vicarage to collect a small box of Elspeth's things set aside by the inspector, and inside it had found an envelope addressed to herself in Elspeth's unmistakable hand. The letter was brief. "Be careful who you speak to. The last bar is not yours alone." Alice's voice trembled as she read it aloud. "I don't know what she meant," she said helplessly. Miss Marple, who did not say so. Instead, she took the letter gently and set it beside the hymn book, the violin case in her mind like a silent instrument awaiting the right hand. That night, Miss Marple sat up later than usual, her knitting abandoned in her lap. The pieces were almost all there: the tune, the code, the walking stick, the letter without an address, the varnished case by the coach road. What remained was to fit them in such a way that the shadow in the picture, the one that had moved between Elspeth and her intended meeting, would stand revealed. And she knew that the moment for quiet listening was nearly done. Soon would come the time to play the last bar, and to see who could not help but answer it. Chapter 10. The last bar played it was Inspector Graves, who called the following morning. But there was nothing casual about the set of his jaw as he stepped into Miss Marple's parlor. Reeves followed, carrying the violin case with the caution of a man aware that the quietest objects may hold the loudest truths. Graves set it down on the table, beside Miss Marple's hymn book and Alice's letter. "I've had enough of hints and half-tunes," he said. "If you've put the pieces together, Miss Marple, now's the time." Miss Marple folded her hands and regarded him with mild composure. "It has been a rather pretty puzzle, Inspector, though of course it is quite horrid underneath. The tune, you see, was not merely an idle habit of Miss Grant's. It was a cipher one she and her cousin used as girls. Each bar, each pause, corresponded to letters in a hymn they knew. That final, missing bar was meant to tell Alice where to collect something here. The violin case along the old coach road." She tapped the hymn book. "But someone else knew the code. Years ago, when Miss Grant was engaged to Robert Harcourt, a violinist of some small talent and very large pride, he saw the cousins play their cipher game. He remembered it, and when he returned to St. Mary Mead under the guise of an itinerant musician, he brought with him not only his violin, but an appetite for whatever Miss Grant had hidden away." Graves's eyes narrowed. "The sealing wax." "Just so," Miss Marple said. "Alice told me Miss Grant had asked for a red stick from her workbox. In those circles, sealing wax can be used to mark or to seal an object in a way only a chosen person recognizes. She intended to mark the case for Alice to find, but Harcourt intercepted the letter, perhaps altered it, and came to claim the case himself. Miss Grant realized too late what had happened. She met him in her parlor, willing enough to let him in, unwilling to give up what was inside without protest. The quarrel turned violent. The blow that killed her came from something to hand, perhaps the fender, or even the walking stick he carried. She glanced toward the case. He returned the stick to the stand so it would not be noticed, polished the brass catches of the case to hide any trace of her touch, and hid it under the coach road hedge to collect later. But he could not resist leaving himself a private flourish. The posting of Lydia Carstone's Thursday lesson notice in the parish gate, marked with a dab of red wax as confirmation. Lydia, you see, has been his confidant. I think she met him in Much Hatham, where her music pupils gave her the perfect excuse for trips. She was the one who helped him slip quietly into the village and quietly out again. There was a small, telling stillness in the room. Graves was not a man for theatrics, but his gaze shifted toward Reeves, and Reeves left without a sound. Miss Marple poured tea. They might have succeeded, you know, had they not both underestimated the resilience of village memory. Lydia was careful, but she knew the violinist too well not to flinch when she heard that tune. And Harcourt's hand was betrayed by the varnish on his walking stick, and the way he carried the case, details anyone could see, but few would think worth remarking upon. The coach road and the parish arch, to halves of the same word in the cipher, were too much of a coincidence for me to ignore. Within the hour, Reeves returned with Lydia in tow, pale but composed, and a man in a crumpled gray suit whose eyes darted like a bow across too many strings. Harcourt's protest was short-lived. Graves's evidence was longer. The wax traces on the case matched those on the parish gate, and fibers from Miss Grant's parlor rug were caught in the ferrule of Harcourt's stick. Faced with the cipher explained in full and Lydia's silence, his bravado shrank like frost and sun. When they were taken away, the village exhaled the long, slow breath it had been holding since the day Miss Grant was found. Mrs. Price returned to selling jam without lowering her voice. Mrs. Elwood took to her roses with renewed vigor, and Tommy Benton ran messages with the lively relief of a boy who had been forbidden the juiciest secret for too long. Miss Marple, in her garden, trimmed the verbena, and thought of Elspeth Grant on her stone wall, humming through her tears. She had tried, in the old way, to send her warning and her trust to the right hands, and though the message had been intercepted, it had also been understood by someone else entirely. Miss Marple laid the hymn book back on its shelf, its ribbon marking the tune's final bar. Later, over tea with Alice, she said, "It is a very sad thing. My dear, how often the small, fond games of our youth become the means by which others think to harm us. But it is also true that such things when remembered can sometimes be turned to quite good account." And she smiled, a little wistfully, as the autumn sun fell in gentle bars across the parlor, the case now empty and the tune, at last, complete.